global supply chains are intricate and they're exposed to all sorts of disruption. Trade wars, geopolitics, inflation, regulation, and as much as resilience has become a mantra for all companies around the world, nobody really knows what that means, how far we're willing to go, and how much we're willing to pay. So, how do we start thinking about resilience in global supply chains? How do we shock-proof, I suppose, global supply chains? Shannon, let's start with you. A macro perspective. Global supply chains have already seen stresses. COVID, the Ukraine war, US-China tensions, and now tariffs. Would you say they're agile or fragile?
Well, that's a great question. And I would actually say, as we look at these last, number of years, and yes, we can point to, disruptions in COVID where, you didn't have goods that you wanted. Really, the story is one of agility. And you saw, the whole world shut down there, and within weeks, sometimes just a few months, everything was back on the shelves. You found a way to move it around. And I would say, again, we are seeing a shock with, the United States putting on all sorts of tariffs, sort of the levels changing, day in and day out as we sort of settle into something. Other governments responding, either some retaliating, like China, others responding by going abroad and negotiating other free trade agreements with other countries. So a real changing of these rules. And again, you are seeing an agility, right? You're not seeing huge changes as of yet in supply, right? Things are still, going to various countries. And, my colleagues here, are in the midst of that. They're moving it around those countries. But you're also seeing it, I would say, in pricing and the like, that there's been a lot of agility there. So a lot has not changed, even with, significant both, physical disruptions with COVID and then policy disruptions over these last several months.
Raj, agile, you move $2 trillion worth of goods every single year. When you take a look at the supply chains now, how are they different from 5 years ago?
Well, the first thing I would say is that if in 2018 or 19 we had this conference right here, this topic wouldn't have been on the agenda. Nobody really cared about supply chains. And it's gone from there to be a boardroom conversation. Now we're even talking things like tariffs and de minimis. So all the things we do have become very cool for everybody now. I think the world has completely changed. As you saw, a lot of things were taken for granted, on the supply chain side of the equation. And then when there was a disruption, suddenly there's a lot of attention being paid. But I think we've got to trace the origins of trade. And, after the Second World War, trade was 4.5% of global GDP. It peaked around a quarter. And it's kind of been there and thereabouts since then. And FedEx moving 17 million packages a day, we are a referendum on the high-value supply chain. Like you said, we move $2 trillion of commerce. We see the patterns changing quite dramatically now, especially in the last 6 to 12 months. I think we are moving from one set of equilibrium state to another, and we are right in the middle of it. And that's what we are now seeing. The word that Shannon just used, agility, is what's really, really important, both from a physical point of view and a technological point of view. I'll just finish with one point. You used the word resilience, which is exactly the right word. People have talked about, you have to be just in time or just in case. But you have to find the right balance where you're efficient and reliable at the same time, and that's where resilience comes in. And only way to do this is at the intersection of the physical networks in place and the technological networks that work hand in hand with that.
Peter, I can't help but feel like there's just too much optimism, there's agility, and we're going to be okay. There are still vulnerabilities out there. Where are they?
No, thanks for that, and it's great to be here. Let me piggyback on what we just heard as a first statement. I think this is actually not new over the last 6 to 12 months. As we heard, this started much earlier. I think earlier it was more the consumer which was driving actually to a more sustainable supply chain. And I think many companies have actually reacted to that rather earlier. But it takes a long time to change supply chains. And you have to be careful that you find the right balance, as we just heard, between the costs you have on the inventory, so you keep the products in your hand, versus actually the cost of disruption. And I think it has shifted that companies across the world in all industries are taking much more into account that the disruption effect is much more costlier compared to actually keeping your product more on the inventory side. And if you talk about those type of comparisons, then you're also thinking about where do I actually have my supply chain? Because there you also have a risk of disruption if you are banking on just one factor. And we can come back to that later. Some companies have always done this in a very different way and have the benefit at the moment. But it is quite clear. We have the vulnerabilities we have that we can talk about rare earth metals, we can talk about the tech sector, the chip sector, etc. And there we have vulnerabilities which are, some of them are more politically driven. We heard the trade, etc., and the tariffs, but others are also because of the evolvement and the evolution of the tech side in the products themselves, which gives us more vulnerability, and therefore we have to think through in a different way how we structure our supply chain.
How are you thinking about resilience in your business? You're in more than 100 countries.
Yeah,
and scale helps for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have the scale, which allows us to do more on different things, but we have never actually had a global supply chain at ABB. My predecessors had the vision that we go max for a regional supply chain, or what we do, which is very in favor today, is we produce local for local. So if I take the US, we are 80% plus of what we sell, we produce in the US. It's 85% in China, it's 95% in Europe. So we always had that strategy that we developed the supply chain within the country or within the region. That gave us a lot of resilience during the difficult times like the COVIDs, but it also helped us actually to design the products for the specific needs of the markets, and therefore also developed then the local supply chains attached to that. So we never went for full efficiency. We had actually a good mixture between reliability, kind of cost of inventory, which we also had to have, and not just optimizing the last cent.
Right. So because of your skill, there's a lot of localization happening. But for a lot of countries and companies, that's not the case. There is a trade-off. Resilience costs money. So how do you think about just in case, just in time? How do you square that, Shannon?
You know, as I think about this, and, you know, as you see sort of geopolitical factors in, I mean, there's a benefit. There's been challenges from diversification if you kind of cross those geopolitical fault lines, especially with the policies that have come down from lots of countries, right? Not just the United States, not just China, but from others. But there's also, and many companies have found this, is that there is also a challenge of geographic concentration, right? And that challenge can be, you know, a natural disaster, which takes out, you know, a particular place you are. We saw that, you know, in the United States with, you know, Hurricane Maria, you know, all kinds of medical equipment was no longer coming from Puerto Rico, so you get that sort of challenge. You have a challenge of geographic concentration if you have a point of failure. We've seen that too in the United States with baby formula, where a plant goes down and all of a sudden we don't import that and we don't have access. So that is one, you know, challenge that I think you face from that concentration. And then there's more sort of amorphous, indirect, which is that you don't necessarily have access to the latest innovations or incremental changes. You don't have access to sort of the networks that you're talking about, the economies of scale and scope. And so I think, you know, as we see some government policies have this ambition to, you know, reshore, bring things all much closer, you know, this idea of, I think, regionalization is sort of the Goldilocks, right? You're not so far away that you know, hit geopolitical fault lines, but you're not so close that you lose the benefits of economies of scale and scope. And I think one thing as we look at the policies that are being laid out is, you know, for any government, even a very wealthy government, it's going to be very hard to subsidize more than maybe a couple industries indefinitely, right? In the end, you're going to have to be commercially viable. And the way you do that is you do need some sort of diversification.
Raj, just in time, just in case, at some point, redundancy is just waste.
Yeah, that's for sure. But I want to talk about this for 1 second here. I think from a FedEx point of view, we are here to serve other people's supply chains. That's our role is slightly different in the sense that we are a referendum on the global supply chains every single day. So the advantage that a company like us has got right now is the fact that we have spent over 52 years now building the networks that's already in place. To the point Shannon was talking about, those networks are very, very critical in that redundancy, because as our customers start to change their supply chain patterns, and some of them, for example, we B2C customers move faster than B2B customers, to Peter's point. But when they move, the fact that we are already in those places, because we're already serving those places, is an advantage that that companies which have already well-established networks have today. So, for example, right here in Asia, in the last few months, literally, we have added flights intra-Asia, for example. We have added flights from Taiwan to Korea. We have added direct flight U.S. to Singapore. We have different connections from Penang and Thailand. So those things, we just are able to connect it. We can move much faster than manufacturing can move their capacity. So that's the agility and the resilience that we have. The world is going from one equilibrium state, maybe of globalization. I don't think it's deglobalization. I think it's reglobalization. There's a new pattern, the sets that are evolving as we speak. And then finally, I would just say, to answer your question, the role of technology becomes extremely critical. At some point, because of the networks and the data and the insights that we have, we've created a digital twin of FedEx that we are able to partner with our customers in a very different way than a supplier-vendor relationship, and to then optimize supply chains. We are getting started in the early stages here, but that's going to get increasingly more and more important as we go forward. That's the only way to balance the inefficiency of more inventory and and diversification. How do you bring it together? Technology is going to have to play a huge part.
When it comes to supply chain, there's a lot of talk about how you need to pull back from your reliance on China. What would be the result of that? Do you see a decoupling of some sort for someone who's operating in China, Peter, in a big way? China's your second largest market. How do you look at that?
Given the way we are positioned from a supply chain point of view, a little bit less of a problem for us, because we are quite self-standing in China, but obviously we are serving a lot of customers, and we see this actually happening. It is not a complete kind of fact that the companies are leaving China, but they're building their supply chain in a different way. The one thing which is a concern to me is that a lot of companies start to do actually or make the changes into tier one suppliers. But that's actually, if you really want to go for the safety net, for reliable supply chain, which is not just in one country, you need to deal with your entire supply chain. Your tier 2 and tier 3 is as important as your tier 1, because otherwise you are still depending on certain jurisdictions where you don't want to have a dependency. And we see this really happening. I think there are two trends. One is that it's not China plus one. I wouldn't call it this way. I think it is that the supply chains are much more regionalized and localized. So that's kind of one trend. And also through that, the manufacturing, they're actually getting smaller. So instead of building one global manufacturing base, you may actually, customers are building 3 or 4 or 5. Now, one would argue that that's a lot of costs. But given the fact that through automation, through robotization, through the use of technology on AI, etc., the costs actually are coming down. You can run, even in a high labor environment like Europe, you can run now a manufacturing let's say at a competitive level to most countries in the world. So all of these effects are actually at work at this stage. Let me add one thing, because I'm also chair of the largest terminal operator, container terminal operator in the world, PSA International here in Singapore. And what we see is actually the network. There we see some shifts. But those who have an established network, they can react much faster. And we discussed this before. Everybody talks about the final customer, the beneficial cargo owner, and that's the last mile. But what are about the other 10,000 miles, which we are actually covering? That's a slightly different game. And there you can't just have a lorry driving up your in front of your house. You need a structure. You need a network, and you need the digital and the softwares to run this in an efficient way, so that you can actually give the help to your customer to have an optimized supply chain. And we forget that from time to time as we just click and we order what it actually means to order something over 10,000 miles. That's his job, but that's my job as well. So.
Peter and Raj, taking offense, we will not forget. It's not just about the last mile. You know, we talk about de-risking from China. Can we de-risk from China without decoupling, Shannon? Mm-hmm.
You know, what's interesting to me, and just picking up what Peter was saying, is that, you know, China, you look back 10, 15 years ago, and trade was about, 60, 65% of its GDP. And it has systematically decreased. It's now roughly a third, right? So it has been lowering the amount of trade as part of its GDP. And part of that is bringing in fewer imports and not just, soybeans and things like that, but intermediate goods, right? Making things within the country. And part of this sort of China plus one or China for China has been that, sort of creating the whole product there and then shipping many things out, as we've seen, and an increasing amount of exports that are going out into the world. So in some ways, they've been de-risking themselves, right? In sort of the reliance. And I think that actually is probably the story of the last, 8+ years, is that, as the world has started talking about distancing, China's taken this seriously and very systematically and comprehensively. And, the rest of the world has not as much. Lots of talk about it, but less of that. As I look at the model and the policies that are out there, China's moving in this direction, and the United States has an ambition, too, to distance here, and they've been somewhat successful. But some of these policies, if we had a China plus one model, I think we may be headed, at least in some industries, to a U.S. plus one model, right? It will be profitable to produce lots in the United States because it's a very wealthy economy, and the prices will be higher because it'll be protected markets, so there'll be reasons to produce there. But perhaps not producing there for export to other markets, because it will just be, the products will be more costly coming off of the assembly line or the shelf. Or some of these other trade agreements that are being signed around the world, not with the United States, will change some of the access to markets and the ability to get into those markets. So I think as we look at this, yes, we're seeing distancing, I think in some ways led by China successfully over this last 8+ years. But then, the U.S. policies will sort of double down on that, and we'll get sort of two different hubs for at least some products that are producing for those own local markets.
What are your flows showing?
So I think from what we see is that China to U.S. traffic is down because of, especially as a result of the de minimis going away. However, China intra-Asia flows are up. China-Europe flows are up. China-Latin America flows are up. So, and then the intra-regional numbers is, also now starting to change as well. So this is a much, much more complex question than just China plus one at this point. Like I said, there's a new equilibrium state being formed in these new supply chain patterns, and they're much more regional in nature. And, like we said, the mix of China's exports are now fundamentally shifted away from the United States, primarily in the B2C now, perhaps more in B2B later, and then they're moving into other lanes.
You say more regional, you see a lot more within ASEAN, for instance.
Yes, we do, and that's why, like I said, we have added more capacity, more flights within the region, connecting some of the other, Vietnam and Singapore, connecting to directly to Singapore, United States, for example. So those kind of things are happening as we speak. That's the agility. We can move our capacity far faster than manufacturing can move. So we know from the bottom up, we see these signals and we can react.
Are these disruptions permanent, or are we looking at them lasting through President Trump's term? I mean, we know that when it comes to investing in resilience, it takes a lot of money, right? You get a sense that it is going to be permanent. Peter?
I think disruption doesn't follow election cycles. They follow actually fundamental changes in the markets. So I think these disruptions, they will stay. I think the supply chain is now really being adjusted. It normally brings a lot of investment dollars, and companies cannot just switch that from one day to another. You have got assets in the ground, and therefore you have to actually use them. So I think we are looking at really a changing pattern here, which will stay. And I think for the first time since World War II, we see industrial national policies coming up left, right, and center, and I think they will not go away that fast. There will be multilateral agreements where like-minded countries, as the Prime Minister here also said in Singapore, will work together. But those who have the power and the markets, they will most probably go more the bilateral path, and hence I think these things will be here for the longer term.
Raj?
Yeah, I think as I said earlier, the industrial economy is going to take a little longer to change, but once it changes, it's difficult to go back. So that's why I mentioned that we are going from one set of equilibrium state to another, and we are right in the middle of this process. Once you get there, you ain't coming back. I mean, so it's going to be there. The other thing is fundamental. I think ultimately the people around the world want to trade and travel, so they're going to figure ways out. And it's not particular one administration or the other. It's ultimately, but the idea of a re-globalized world is probably something that's real.
Industrial policy is not just the US and China, because the US and China are doing it, other countries will follow suit.
Yeah, you're seeing that. And then just to pick up on Raj's point about technology, I mean, as you think about building new factories, and you're not going to build the factories of 20 years ago, right? You're going to build a totally different factory. And we've talked about here, dark factories, and maybe they won't have no lights, but we're going to see a very different element. And that capital investment, the technological investment, there will be opportunities to put in places where you might not have put 20 years ago. And I think that will be part of this disruption. Once you start building those, I think it does not depend on electoral cycles. It really depends on the technological cycles. And if you look at the investment that's happening around the world, particularly in the United States, but all over, right? It is in those technologies. It's in energy and data centers and that future. And that matters for, some of the services that we often talk about, but it's going to matter for this nuts and bolts of factories as well.
All right, let's pause for our poll. The question today is, what's the best way to reduce supply chain risk? What is the best way to reduce supply chain risk? A, stockpiling. B, nearshoring. C, data transparency and security. D, diversification. Sorry, no choices for all of the above, just one of them. Stockpiling, nearshoring, data transparency, security, diversification. Tough choice, I think. In the meantime, perhaps we can talk about, you touched on how technology, data, will be important,
yes.
right? I mean, you use that to anticipate the black swan events. How is it playing out for you?
Well, this is a very critical point here, and I think especially as we, the things are changing, we see the demand pattern changing like we talked about. Operationally, we are on the front lines. We're one of the largest brokers in America, so we have to now, as we move, products from one country to another through the borders. Before people took it for granted, but now it's getting increasingly more complex, and we have to operationally do that. But the other component of this is technology. Just think about it. For every commodity, every country to every other country, for every commodity, we have the data for classification. We have the data because we needed to have it for doing our jobs. But what we have done is created a data structure and platform, and now it comes with Gen AI to run against these models. So, for example, if somebody is trying to ship something from place A to place B, the number of possible combinations of classification codes you need today are incredible. I mean, before people didn't need it because it was, there was various mechanisms, de minimis, whatnot, to get through that. But today you don't have that choice. You have to now figure out what is your classification code that's going to get you across the border. So we are now using Gen AI tools to be able to predict that with more and more confidence using the data that we have. So now the data that we have had over the last 40 years, 50 years of operation, that becomes extremely critical, and that's why technology is going to play a significant role. And the other part of it, and I'll just briefly mention it, is that when we talk about supply chain resilience, to be able to create common data platforms with our customers so that we can build the best supply chain solution together versus a supplier-vendor mentality of before.
I just want to refer to the results of the poll. Diversification, 72%. Nearshoring, 24%. Data transparency and security, 4%. Stockpiling, 0%. Interesting, stockpiling. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that people thought stockpiling was the way to go, right, Shannon?
And it may be the way to go in areas of, economic security, right? It may be for basic medicines, it may be for critical minerals, it may be for certain things you do want stockpiles. And we're seeing governments talk about that, adding that. But, right, I mean, I think what this poll shows and what the conversation shows is that when we're thinking about the broad economy, that's not how you're going to do it, right? It has to be a different pattern. I mean, one thing just to add on what you're talking about technology, I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is I watch these free trade agreements signed, and many that the United States just signed with, Asian countries on the recent visit of President Trump is, there's lots written in there about transshipment, about rules of origin, fuzzy, not yet defined, but, if you're going to continue to see these trade in the movement, at least with the United States, there's going to have to be more tracing than there is. And there is, the technology there. The U.S. Customs is investing billions of dollars to have some of that they can scale up, and companies are going to have to do it as well with, FedEx or others.
Well, the complexity is clearly going up, and the days of doing basic algebra is over. You need to do advanced calculus, and that's why we need people like us.
Peter?
We talked about all the costs which are coming in because of the supply chain changes. I think technology is going to be the key which works the other way, which actually takes costs out of the system. Because the transparency of where your products are, how the ship sailing will go, in our case, in your case, it's the airplanes, etc. There we have now technologies which will save us costs on the one side, but it will also be very, very positive on, for example, for climate change. Because the more we can reduce the sailing time because we have optimized data, the less CO2 actually we will be burning. So there is, I think we need to see this in a very integrated way, that it is not only a cost, it's actually an opportunity, and there is value attached to that if we apply the technology in the right way. And I think that's where, and you use the partnerships with the customer, I think that's where the trust element comes into it. So a company like ABB, but also PSA International, which I also chair, we need to, and we will work with our customers, with the liners, in order to optimize actually the supply chain. And through that, we can actually also, therefore, produce incremental value for the ultimate customer, which should also help on the pricing side.
One of the key discussions right now is the supply chain of rare earth, right? Because there is a dominance, China's dominance in the space. How should we start thinking about it? I mean, the thing about rare earths is that it is not rare. It's just producing it gets complicated because it comes with an environmental cost. How do you build that resilience in rare earths? How do you start thinking about a strategy for it when there are few alternatives?
Right. Well, this is sort of that idea of diversification that rose in the poll. I think on areas like this, it's where it's most important. And you've seen, as you say, a concentration in the processing and the refining that has given, if not a monopoly, a real dominance in the market and ability to control price or just access. And, what's interesting to me is just in a few weeks, we have seen, or a few months, we have seen governments begin to react fairly quickly, right? You see the U.S. government investing in and taking stakes in companies that will, process rare earths, create rare earth magnets. You have seen the beginnings of long-term contracts, so you're not dependent on market prices, which when you have a dominant player, you can, drive them up, you can drive them to zero to drive people out of the market. So you're starting to see, and it's not just the U.S., Europe and others are going there. And this isn't just this administration, right? We saw in the last administration, from the United States side at least, going out and looking for like a critical mineral security partnership, engaging with other countries. And, we've talked a lot about the worries here, but this is a huge opportunity. Because, as you say, rare earths are not that rare. And there are a lot of countries out there that want to be involved in sort of technological supply chains. And this is an entree for many that have reserves or could also do some of this next step up in sort of the value.
But it takes a long time.
It does take a long time. But, it is something where you can move. And I think that is the challenge, right? We saw, 10 plus years ago, Japan had a similar challenge with rare earths and access to them. And they started changing their supply chain and are not as dependent. And now it's time for, I think, other countries to do the same.
Peter?
I would like to add here R&D. So it's not just that you optimize your supply chain today. It has a big impact on how you do R&D. I use one example. We are the biggest electric motor producer as ABB. We just brought the first one into the market now where we don't, for magnets, because you need magnets in motors, we don't use rare earth metals anymore. We just do it without. So I think the point which I'm trying to make here is actually that the innovation capabilities, they are now really coming to the forefront. This is triggered now to find different solutions to deal with the dependency on maybe one dominant player. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that one. It will take time, but I think everybody is working on solutions on this one.
Well, I think you answered the rare earths pretty well. I'll just take a broader point here. I mean, the theory of...
You're indirectly impacted by rare earths. So.
Well, no, but theory of comparative advantage was the way things happened for many years. Now, suddenly, a lot of things under the national security umbrella are now being, there's restrictions on that. So rare earths fall under that bucket. There are many other things. So we need to have a cogent policy around it. We used to talk about, small yard, but, tall walls to make sure that there's a clarity on what those things are. I think we kind of, we need to get back to that place where if we're going to do some of these commodities as a restricted, then you need to be clear about what those are. So the rules of the game are clear, then people can work towards that. I think it's when it is in flux is when there's a lot of questions.
As we wrap up, I just want to ask a question to every one of you. What's a key point, whether it's technology, policy, regulation, what's key to securing supply chain resilience? Peter, let's start with you.
I think for me it's technology. I think we use technology in various ways here, but I think the impact of the newest technologies like AI, previously it was digital, but also the way we develop our supply chains and the products. We even redesign products because for local specific requirements, because we cannot produce a certain components within that country. Then instead of actually importing it, we just redesign the product. And therefore, technology plays an enormous role in the medium and long term here.
I think robust physical networks, and I've used those very carefully, networks, and that is you can get from one place anywhere in the world to any other place, combined with the technology, combined with an equilibrium set of rules of the game. I think when those three things come together, then we get to a new state of resiliency.
Shannon, the final word.
As I look at all these policies, technology, network, all of those I think are important, but in the end, to create sort of viable and competitive networks, it's going to end up with market forces. So I think that is where companies are going to have to make a decision, what is the right price and where am I going to place myself? So I think we're going to see some movement, but in the end, I would just say supply chains are rather sticky. And through all of these disruptions, if you have a supplier and a customer that you know and you know well, it's hard to change. So I think we may see less movement than the policies or these other things we're talking about would suggest.
Shannon, Raj, Peter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.